Did you turn mic 1 on? Okay. All right, so it's going to be an interesting night tonight because we're trying the new system again, so we'll see how it works. One of the things with it is I have this on, so it's going to be weird to have a sound system on Wednesday night, but that's the best way we can do that to get that through. Don't have the TV here, so it's picture-in-picture for those that are at home. So we'll see what happens. It's going to be good. I also can't use my other iPad program, so we got a new one this week. We're doing like we do on Sunday morning, so that's why we have the really nice background on there instead of just black, white letters on black. When I do it, it's white letters on black. When my wife does it, it's white letters on fancy background. So that's right. It does kind of have that chalkboard feel to it, doesn't it? So anyway, tonight we're going to continue on. We're going to be talking about Joseph still, and we're going to be doing 3 chapters. So we're going to be doing chapters 39 through 41. And so we're going to be moving pretty good. There's a lot of verses we're going to do. However, the verses are telling a story. So it's not just little historical snippets. We're going to kind of be reading a story through this. So we're going to talk about Joseph's time as he went down to Egypt. When we left off last week, he had gone and been sold into slavery, essentially, by his brothers. They sold him to the Ishmaelites or the Midianites, and they took him down to Egypt, and he was sold into Potiphar's household. That's where we're going to pick up the story, and we're going to do a good chunk of Joseph's life tonight. So starting out in verse 39, again, we're going to talk about him beginning in Egypt. Now, we also talked last week, and I want to kind of lead off with this to get it in our minds, that Joseph probably didn't like anything that he's going through here. Okay? So this was not something that he went, all right, sounds good. I'll be sold into slavery. It's fine. It'll all work out. I'm sure this is something that he would have much rather not done. However, he trusts God as he goes through each of these situations. And that's the reoccurring theme that we're going to keep seeing, is that he gives it over to God and he trusts God and he stays faithful to God even in the worst of situations. And so that's kind of the takeaway from this, or that take-home thing is that even in the worst situations of his life, when it seems pretty hopeless, he's still counting on God to do something. Whether it's deliver him from that position or just give him the strength to continue to go forward in that position. Because that's the other thing, is Joseph's not saying, God, I'll believe in you if you do this for me. Instead, I'm going to trust you, Lord, wherever I am and whatever I'm doing. So it says, starting in 39 then, it says, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of the Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. So he was sold. He's property of Potiphar now and brought into his household. It says, the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything that he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything that he owned. Now, when we read that, I want you to keep one thing in mind. It says that Potiphar put him in charge of everything because he saw that the Lord had blessed him, and the Lord was blessing him. Potiphar has no clue about the God of Israel. Okay, so it's not that he said, you're so faithful and I can see that the God of Israel is doing it. That's not what he's doing. What he's seeing is everything Joseph puts his hand to is successful. And so whether he's realizing it's a particular God or just the gods in general or just his good luck, he's looking at Joseph and going, everything you do is good. And so he starts to trust him more and more. And when he puts his trust in Joseph, it's not misplaced. Joseph doesn't take advantage of it. And so he knows that he can put a little bit more in his hands and that Joseph is trustworthy with it. And that's why he entrusted everything in his household, everything that he owned, to Joseph and said, manage it for me. Because what you're doing is great. What you're doing is successful. So he said, you be my manager over all this stuff because obviously you've got the touch. Well, the touch is the Lord. The Lord is prospering everything that he does. And Joseph, in turn, then, is faithful in everything that he does. All it would have taken was Joseph one time, maybe skimming a little bit off the top here, or took advantage of this here, or didn't do his duties here, and he would have lost this position. So this is not just because the Lord blessed him. Yes, it was because the Lord blessed him, but it was also because Joseph was faithful. And he remained faithful to the Lord through all this. So it says, from the time that he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except for the food that he ate. And again, Joseph earned his trust, and he kept it. Joseph did what he was called to do. Now again, he's a slave. He's living as a slave in bondage to Potiphar, but he is faithful to his tasks, and he's not taking advantage of any situation that he can. He's not looking to harm his master. He's not looking to get away from him. He's not looking to do that. He's accepted the position that he's in, and he's doing it to the best of his ability for himself, for his master, but also because of his faith in God. And so he is doing the best at where he is at and not slacking or cutting corners. It said, now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. But he refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you. There's my limit. No, it's not going to happen. And so he says, you know what? I've earned this position. I've earned this trust. And all it would have taken was for Joseph to be unfaithful in that moment. And again, he would have lost everything. But he knew that what she was asking was against God's, going to be law, what God would entrust him to do, but it was also going to be something that would break the trust of his master. And so he said, because of my faith, because of my trust that I have with my master, I won't do this. I won't betray him like that. And it says, because you are his wife, how then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to even be with her. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. Look, she said to them, this Hebrew who's been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When his master heard the story his wife had told him, saying that this is how your slave treated me, he burned with anger. Now, I've heard different people talk about this situation and about whether the burning with anger was against Joseph or against his wife. Because he probably knew his wife, and he really knew Joseph, and everything was going so good in his household and so good in his life, and even this accusation destroyed all that. And so I'm sure he was very angry, and exactly where that anger was pointed, we don't know for sure, but we know what he had to do. He has a servant who's been accused of making advances to his wife. This slave has come and made an advance to somebody who is of position in Egypt. And so he has to punish the slave. And, again, whether the anger was all directed to Joseph or some directed to each, or maybe most of it was directed to her. We don't know for sure. But he was very angry because the situation had changed, because that trust, that faith had been broken. One way or the other, that trust was gone. And so something had to change. And it says, Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. So that's the first verse of 40. We're kind of jumping into the next little deal here. But so Joseph goes from a position of high standing in Potiphar's household, and because of an accusation and because of what happened, he gets thrown in prison. He's in prison for a while. Now, this took a little time to, come about. This wasn't just an overnight thing. But he proved himself in prison, and God blessed him and showed him favor in the eyes of the warden or the person in charge of the jail. And pretty soon, Joseph's in charge of the jail. He's a prisoner still, and he's a slave still. So he is a servant in Egypt, and he is in prison. And basically, they said, you know what, Joseph, when you go to bed at night, would you turn the lights off and lock the doors? They gave him position over everything, and even over the other prisoners and stuff, and said, you know what? I can trust you. They knew that because of his faith, because of his work ethic, because he had proven himself over and over again, that they could trust him. He's back in a position of trust. And it's so important to see that through this story, that is what keeps coming back in Joseph's favor, is he is faithful. He is faithful to his commitment with God, and he knows the way that he should act towards other people. And he internalizes that in everything that he does. And so every position he gets, he's faithful in. He doesn't whine about it. He doesn't cause problems. He doesn't start riots. He doesn't do all that kind of stuff. If he would have done any of that in the prison, he'd have been locked in a corner cell someplace, and they'd have forgot he was there. He's a slave. He has no standing in Egypt. He has no family there to take care of him. He has no position whatsoever. He is about as low as you're going to get, and he's in a dungeon. But yet, he proves himself faithful. And he proves that he can be trusted because of his faith. And he gives God the credit for his faith. But he continues to stay faithful in everything, and so they know that they can trust him in it. So in the next verse, we just started chapter 40, where it says, sometime later, the cupbearer, the baker, the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. So here's Potiphar still, the captain of the guard. This is basically his prison. Okay? And here's Joseph raising to the rank of the top guy in there. The only person higher is the jailer himself. And he's come up in this, and now lo and behold, here's two people from Pharaoh's court that served directly to Pharaoh. Now they have offended him, and they've been put in prison. And Pharaoh told the captain of his guard, you take them back to your jail and put them in jail there. And so that's where they sit. It says, the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night. And each dream had a meaning of its own. So Joseph's here now, locking up the prison, essentially. And these two guys come in there, and they each have a dream. Each one of them is going to be perplexed by the meaning of this dream. And so here they are in jail. They have these dreams, and here's what they are. It says, when Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, why do you look so sad today? We both had dreams, they answered, but there is no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. So here's Joseph not saying, oh, I've got this. I'm a dream interpreter. I'm really good at dreams. You should hear the dreams I had about my brothers. Matter of fact, that's why I'm here. But he says, interpretations don't belong to man. They belong to God. So tell me your dreams, and we'll see what God says. So it says, the chief cupbearer told Joseph in his dream, he said to him, in my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into the Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup into his hand. This is what it means, Joseph said to him. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. And will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. So there's the first thing that would even be kind of close to a grumbling from him, is he's like, here's the interpretation of your dream. In 3 days, you're going to be working for Pharaoh again. You're going to be standing right in front of him, handing him his cup again. You're going to be there. Mention me if you would. I shouldn't even be here. It's a big mistake, kind of. So when you're back in good graces with him, put in a good word for me. Maybe he can get me out of here, do whatever. And then so it goes on with Joseph here. He says, I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. So he says, I'd like to have a chance for appeal. But the court system in Egypt at this time was not really something that you could file an appeal with. And so the only hope you had was to get word out from maybe somebody who was coming out of prison like this cupbearer was and say, I know a guy down there that probably shouldn't be there. And maybe you could get enough interest where somebody would look into it and find out why you were there. But otherwise, you're pretty much there. And so he says, just keep me in mind when you go back before the Pharaoh. Then in 16 it says, when the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, I too had a dream. He's like, hey, that's a pretty good deal. This guy has a dream, he talks to you, and in 3 days he's getting out. I had a dream too. I'm ready to go. Let me out of here. So he says, on my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. This is what it means, Joseph said. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Baker's going, okay, we're on a good start. 3 days for me too. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away at your flesh. Ouch. Yeah, not the interpretation he was really probably hoping for, but that's what the dream came back to. He said, you know what? Cupbearer, in 3 days, you'll be standing before Pharaoh again. Everything's good. Baker, in 3 days, you're done. Pharaoh's going to put you to death. It says, now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Once he got back to his position, it says he forgot him. It may have been that he actually forgot him, or it may have been that the cupbearer went, I'm not going to mention nothing to nobody because I'm back where I want to be and I ain't going to make waves. And so some slave prisoner down here, not worth wasting my breath to Pharaoh over because Pharaoh's not going to really care. So he just forgot about it. Said, nope, ain't saying nothing. But Joseph now has had a reputation building where everything that he is assigned not only prospers, but he does it well. He does it faithfully. He does it without any kind of a qualm, and people know that you can trust this guy. And so here he is. Now, add to the resume, he's a dream interpreter. We both told him a dream, and both came true, exactly the way he interpreted them. And so now the people, I mean, even though he's not being mentioned to Pharaoh, that's back there. That this guy even can interpret dreams. Now, Joseph, we're going to see, is easy and fast to say, it's not me. It's God working through me. It's not me that comes up with the interpretations, it's God. But yet at the same time, people are saying, hey, I recognize something here. I recognize something special in this. And it says, when 2 full years had passed. So, he's been taken to Egypt. He was sold into Potiphar's house. Don't know the exact time frame of how long it took him to get to that position of authority there. But again, it didn't happen in a day or a week. It took time. He got to the position in Potiphar's household, and then he goes to prison. It takes time for him to get to that position where he becomes the chief prisoner, essentially, and gets trusted in that position. He tells the cupbearer and the baker their dreams, and then the cupbearer is restored, the baker's been put to death, and now 2 more full years are going to pass. And Joseph's still in prison. And he's still doing his job, and he's still being faithful to what he's been called to do, and he's still being faithful to God, and he is still just as trustworthy as he was when they put him in there. And so 2 years have passed. So again, to me, that speaks to me and says, wow, we have to be a little bit patient sometimes, because Joseph was probably really hoping that in that 3rd day when the cupbearer was restored, he'd mention Joseph, and within a day or so, he might be getting called up there to get talked to. But instead, 2 years go by, and he's still in his same position, and he's still there in the dungeon. And it says, when 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat. And they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. Now, one of the things that I just kind of want to add here, this is kind of, sideline commentary, is Pharaoh has this dream about the Nile. One of the things about Egypt, and especially at this time, we don't have modern irrigation. They don't have ways of transporting a lot of water and things like that. So every year, the Nile would flood. And it would flood the entire valley down there. And the water levels would go up. It would go out of its banks. It would flood these big field areas and stuff like that. Then the water would subside and go back down into the river. Well, in doing so, the river would saturate the ground around the Nile. And so they could plant their crops and they would grow because there was water in a water table just below the surface there and stuff. It had been fully saturated. It was kind of like our backyard when we had flooding here several years ago. And if you walked more than 10 feet away from the building, the ground started going because it was so close, the water was right there. It looked dry, but if you start walking on it, it just kind of squished underneath your feet. And that's what the Nile does. It floods. It fills those areas, the water recedes back into the riverbed, but it leaves water out in those fields and stuff so that they can plant their crops, and there's enough moisture there to let the crops grow. They harvest them in, then they let it sit. The Nile floods, it puts water back into the ground, they plant their crops, the crops grow, it goes back to the next thing, and it does this year after year. They have this yearly flooding so that they can plant crops. And so when he sees the cows coming up out of the Nile, he's seeing the giver of life. The Nile was that thing in Egyptian mythology and Egyptian culture that gave life. The Nile was what they survived on. If it didn't flood, you had a drought. You had famine. Because if it didn't flood, you didn't have crops. And so here, he's got this dream of these cows and these plants that are down by there that are growing and so healthy. And there's 7 cows that come out. And then out of that comes 7 gaunt, ugly cows. They eat up the good cows. Good heads of grain eaten up by nasty, dry heads of grain. And so he's getting a vision of what's going to happen with the Nile, but also with the whole region there. And so it says, in the morning, his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Oh, guess what? Forgot to tell you something, Pharaoh. 2 years ago, I had a message for you, and it just came back to mind. It says, the Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. The things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Now again, this is in Egyptian culture and society. Pharaoh is God on earth. They believed that he was God that came and sat before man. So here's this Hebrew slave brought out of the dungeon and stood before what they considered God on earth. And they said, he wants to see you. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, which, again, probably not the best lead-in line for God on earth. Nope, can't do it. I can't interpret the dream. Then why did I bring you here? You know, he's probably thinking to himself, what are you doing here? He says, I can't do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. It's not me. It's my God. And my God knows your dreams. And he gave you your dreams. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream I was standing on the bank of the Nile, when out of the river there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. I had never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first. But even after they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so. They looked just as ugly as before. Then I woke up. In my dream, I saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. I told this to the magicians, and none of them could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterwards are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. So he says, you're lucky. God has told you his plans. Now, what are you going to do with it? Because this is what's about to happen. You're going to have 7 years of abundance where people think, man, this is great. Not a care in the world. Look at all the grain we have. Look at the flocks and the herds and the meat that we have and the crops, and everything is great. Everything is wonderful. But then you're going to have 7 years of severe famine like you've never seen. That's coming right on the heels of it. So it says, and now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? He said, okay, it's a great plan. Joseph's told us what's going to happen. Joseph's told us what we need to do is we need to find a wise man in Egypt, one that's going to put away 5% of everything that we grow, that's going to be there to keep tabs on this, to build storehouses, to store this stuff, to get it all put away so that we have food when it comes time for the famine. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. That's a pretty good afternoon. You wake up that morning, Hebrew slave in the bottom of a dungeon in Egypt, and by that night, you're second in command of all of Egypt. You are the Pharaoh's right-hand man. No one has authority over you but Pharaoh himself. That's a pretty good bump to go from, I'm nothing, to, wow, the whole nation is looking at him. And it's also interesting to look at the fact that all that time when Joseph was being faithful, it was preparing him for this moment. This was God's plan, that Joseph could be that deliverer for not only Egypt, but we're going to see for Israel as well, for Jacob and his family. Joseph was put in the right place at the right time, but he was faithful to what God called him to do, and that set him up to be in the place where he needed to be. If Joseph had got mad and stomped his feet and pouted the first time, he'd have never been standing before Pharaoh. He'd have still been tucked away in that corner cell down there, and people would even forgot he existed. But because he was faithful, and because he trusted God, and because he did what he knew God would have him do, which was serve faithfully and to be there and do whatever he could as long as he was there, he's now been raised to that position of authority that he's equipped to do. It says, only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said, the only thing that makes me better than you in Egypt is the fact that I'm Pharaoh. Everything else goes through you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes and fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, make way! Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all of Egypt. He says, you're the man. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphaneath-Paneah. How's that for a name? He probably said, I like Joseph better. It's easier to spell. No. So he says, this is now your name, Zaphaneath-Paneah, and gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Now, we can go back to that name. And you might be wondering, what does that name mean? And since it was given to Joseph, we've all been wondering, what does that name mean? We really don't know, to be honest with you. So you might read in your books, if you have Bible commentaries and stuff, or you have footnotes at the bottom of your Bible, it might give you an interpretation. And it could be something like God prepares him, or the store up in abundance, or God sees and he lives, something like that. Those are all good guesses. Because the thing is when it was given to him in Egyptian. And when it was recorded in Hebrew. It was also not recorded at the time it happened. It was recorded by Moses many years later. And so what we're getting is a transliteration of what it sounded like in Egyptian. And so the actual what hieroglyphic symbols he had, the actual sound of what it was, we don't know for sure. And so people have said, well, Zaphan, Naeth, those kind of sound like he saves, or he protects, or he gives, or he stores. Oh, he stores. Maybe that would be good, because Joseph built storehouses and stuff. So he stores, and then Paneah, let's see, well, that kind of sounds like, forgiveness, or living, or maybe blessed by God, or so they kind of tried to put in what they think it sounds like. And some scholars, now I'm making light of it a little bit here, but some scholars have done some incredible research and work on this, and none of them can say this is what it is. The best you will get out of the best scholars will say it kind of sounds like it could be this, or this. So we don't know for sure what it was, but whatever it was a title as well as a personal name that he went by. It was kind of like Pharaoh himself. He had this title of the one who would be in charge of everything. And Pharaoh gave him his ring, and he gave him a chariot, and he gave him servants to run before him, shouting, "Make way for him." And they shouted out his name, and he gave him a wife and said, he is now in charge. The only one who has authority over Joseph is me. Otherwise, what he says goes. And so Joseph is elevated to the highest rank of authority in all of Egypt. And so he was given Potiphar's daughter to be his wife, and Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So now you can go back and you can start putting those years back together. What did it say he was when he went out to look for his brothers? 17. 13 years later, he's put in charge of Egypt. But that's 13 long years of being a slave, being nothing, and being in a dungeon. 13 years he was faithful to God without seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. Because see, we have to remember, we know the rest of the story. When he was put in prison, and even when he was sold into slavery and taken to Egypt, he didn't know 13 years later I'll be in charge of all this. He didn't know that someday I could be next to Pharaoh himself. He's thinking, I hope I'm alive tomorrow. And that's the way he basically lived for 13 years, is I hope nobody else accuses me of something. I hope nobody else sells me out for something. I'm just going to remain faithful, and I'm going to keep working for God, and I'm going to keep doing what I know I need to be doing, and we'll see what happens. And finally, on that last day, he is skyrocketed to a position of authority and given clothes and jewelry and rings and wife and home and chariots and all this kind of stuff, because God was preparing him for that moment. And it says, so he was 30 when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt, and he stored it in the cities. And each city he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. That's a lot of grain. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." So that's why he has Manasseh. The second son is named Ephraim, and he said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." So he has these 2 sons. And again, time is moving on. He's now over 30. He's working for Pharaoh. He's stored up. He's done 7 years storing up grain. He's getting ready for the time of famine to come. He has these 2 sons. He is settled into Egypt, and he is working his way there now. And it says, the 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph has said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you." When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe everywhere. So there's the story for tonight. Is that, again, God prepared Joseph to be in that position so that he could store up the grain and so that he could save not only Egypt, but the world at that time. So the Egyptians, they were storing up their own stuff. They were paying their basic tax to Pharaoh, and Joseph was storing all that away. But people also knew the famine was coming, so they were storing up grain and stuff. And after the famine hit, for a while, they were okay. Yeah, we got some stuff in storage here. We're doing good. We're doing good. And then the famine got so severe, the Egyptians started running out of food. Well, the famine stretched all the way up into what's now Israel, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, whatever. All those people needed food as well. And so that's why we're saying the whole world began to come to Egypt to buy from Joseph. Guess who's living up there in the land of Canaan? Yeah, his family. And you know who's feeling the famine just as much as anybody else? His family. And they're up there starving and going, what are we going to do? And Joseph, who's probably given up all hope of ever seeing his family again, is down in Egypt saving the world from this famine and living in this position that he's been given. So that is where we're going to end the story tonight. So there you go. Even have a fancy closing slide. All right, questions or comments? He is the captain of the guard, and the guard house, or the jail that he is in, that Joseph is in, is kind of attached to all of that. Oh yeah, I'm sure. Oh, and definitely once Pharaoh took his position and said, Joseph, now you're in charge of all this stuff, and sent him through the streets on a chariot with people running before him, shouting his name, I'm sure Potiphar goes, I know that guy. And probably thinking to himself, no grudges, right? We're good. You and I are good, even though I've kept you in prison for 13 years. We're good? Okay. So, yeah, I'm sure that Potiphar would have recognized Joseph in his ascent to all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I'm sure he did. I'm sure that was part of the process of, Pharaoh, when he said, obviously you're a wise man, you can do this, but he would have also had people check out who this guy was. If he was some criminal, he wouldn't have put him in charge of all the funds. And so he had him checked out, so I'm sure that, yeah, he'd talk to the guards and talk to the people in prison and Potiphar, or his guys did. He probably didn't, but so. other questions or comments? Or mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that you can, be careful because Google will tell you anything it wants to. But yeah, there are examples of excavated, that archaeologists have gone back and excavated storehouses from around that time period and things like that. Some of them are absolutely huge. They're just insane how big they are. And they'll give you a good idea, like you said, of what we're kind of looking at, the scope of what Joseph did. And in each city, built multiple of these storehouses so that all the fields around them could go into these central locations and deposit this grain. Because, it even says that he collected so much grain they stopped counting. They couldn't even measure it all. It was just like, just dump it in there. We got plenty. So the scope of what this is, and then the scope to have enough to feed all of Egypt and then all the surrounding countries as well. The amount of grain that he collected is it's huge. But yeah, you can go, I would recommend doing that. Go and Google some of the Egyptian storehouses, and you can even put in qualifiers like Joseph and stuff like that, and it'll kind of narrow it down more to that time period. But yeah, it's definitely worth checking out. You're talking in the 1800s probably here, BC. 1800 BC. So that gives you, when you're looking at the little pictures, that gives you kind of a time frame to be looking for. So. Anything else? Anyone else? Actually, it'd probably even be before that a little bit. Well, about in that range. Get the timeline all straight and work the edges. All right. No other comments? No other questions? All right. Then. Yeah, if he suspected that Joseph was really doing that, he would have put him to death. I'm guessing, not just put him in prison and then have him be in prison in a place where he would even have contact with anybody else. Yeah, I think if Potiphar really felt that he had done that or attempted that, he would have had him put to death. So that's why I said, it depends on how you want to interpret that or read that. But yes, Potiphar was very angry, but we don't know for sure who he was the most angry with. He was just very angry, and a good portion of it could have been he was just angry because everything was going so good, and now it's gone because of this accusation. So, all right. Mm-hmm. Potiphar. Probably not, but based on the same Egyptian kind of beliefs or gods. So it probably wasn't a relative, but region, clan type thing. It could have been something like that. But it does sound pretty close. They were the Joneses of Egypt, the Smiths and the Joneses. And all right. Well, if not, let's go ahead and we'll close in a word of prayer. We got about 10 minutes before the kids come swooping down here, so have a few minutes to talk if you'd like to do that. So let's go ahead and close in a word of prayer, and then we'll just have some time to wait. Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you and we thank you for the opportunity to come into your house this evening, to come and to look at your word and to look at the story of Joseph. And Lord, just to really concentrate and pay attention on the way that your plan moved through everything, regardless of how it would look to man. We're thankful that Joseph was faithful and that he was truthful and that he was trusting in you even when he didn't know what was going to happen next. He remained faithful in everything that he did. But Lord, you took that, and as we will read later, what man intended for evil, you used for good. And you were able to spare the lives of so many people because of the situation that Joseph went through. So Lord, we are thankful for his faithfulness. We're thankful for his trusting in you and following you. We're thankful for your plan, Lord. We know that you still have a plan for each one of our lives in each and every day. And so Lord, let us be faithful and true to you in everything that we do, knowing that we are carrying out your plan in everything that we do as well. So, Lord, just be with us, watch over us, and keep us. Lord, I pray that you would bring us back together so that we can continue to look at your word and apply it to our life. We come to you in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all for coming.